Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited because I'm joined by Rich Preston, who is a anchor of BBC World News and BBC News Channel. He's also a very multi-talented guy because he doesn't just anchor the news. He's also a radio host for BBC Topline and BBC World Service Radio, I believe it is. Yep, and has done some incredible things. So Rich was the first person to report on the first death in China of the first person who died of COVID. So that's going to be, we could definitely dive into that. He's trained journalists in Africa, which I think is amazing. He was a former police officer, and he also found time to be a winner of the Blue Peter badge. So, Rich, it's an honor to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Chris. Really good to be talking to you.
So, firstly, I think you need to do a course on time management because it's absolutely insane the amount of things that you've done and that you are doing. And I know you do some cool stuff in your spare time as well. So yeah, that, LinkedIn coming soon, Rich Preston on time management. I'm expecting that. But we'll get to that. I think the first thing I really want to ask is how you got into journalism. Like, how did that happen for you? Because now you're a very successful BBC anchor. What was the beginning for you? How did it all start?
Well, do you know what? I had always been interested in radio from a really young age. I mean, a really, really young age. I'd always been fascinated with radio. And I think a big part of that comes from the fact that I grew up in a very rural area of northeast Scotland. I grew up in Aberdeenshire. And so we spent a lot of time in the car because anytime you had to go to the supermarket, it was a 20-mile drive, or go to your friend's house, it was a 10-mile drive. And so I grew up listening to a lot of radio. And I know it's a cliche to say it, but there's this connection in radio. When it's a good radio interview or program, there is just that connection between the host, the interviewee, whatever, and the person who's listening. And so when I was 14, I signed up to volunteer for the local hospital radio station in Aberdeen, which meant giving away every Saturday I had, because I would get up at 7 a.m. from the age of 14 to make my way into the local village to get the bus into Aberdeen, which was a 90-minute journey there. Then I would spend the day doing hospital radio, and then I would take the 90-minute bus journey home to the village, and then one of my parents would come pick me up from the village, or I would walk the 3-4 miles home from the village back to my house. And it was so much fun because you just got to play around. You got to learn how to use the studio. You got to host your own show. You got to go around the hospital wards, chatting to the patients that were listening and talking to them. And so, as a 14-year-old, getting to play in a radio studio was just really, really cool. And when I was nearing the end of secondary school, I thought, well, I'll go and do a degree in journalism and media. That's what people do, right? They go to university. And so I did. I went to university in Stirling, and I did a degree in their film, media and journalism department. And I loved it. It was a very practical course. And I joined the student radio station as well. So lots of hands-on, lots of keeping in on it. And then when I was nearing graduation, I kind of had this moment where I was like, what am I actually going to do with this? Because I don't know any journalists. My family are not journalists. I don't know anyone in the media industry. I didn't know any journalists growing up. My dad left school at, I think, 15, 16 to join the Navy as a ship's mechanic. My mum was a physiotherapist. And so in my final year of studies, we got this talk from this BBC producer. This was the first journalist producer type person I'd kind of properly met. And I got his contact details and I hung on to them for dear life. And I contacted him and I kept in touch with him. And from there, I found out about different internships that were going on. I applied for pretty much every internship you could imagine. And I ended up landing one in Manchester, which is not where I'm from. So I had to work my backside off all of my summer between finishing university and between going and starting this internship to save up enough money to move to Manchester to fund this 3-month unpaid internship, pay rent, buy food, all this kind of stuff. Because this was back in the day when unpaid internships for that length of time were totally legal. It was absolutely fine. I got some opportunities there to work on some really fascinating programs for Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Live, the World Service. It was just fantastic exposure and experience. And then that came to an end, and they didn't give me a job. And I had to move home back to Aberdeen to my parents, which was wholly depressing at the time as a 22-year-old, having worked on all these cool programs. And I was put in touch with a freelance producer in Aberdeen who made documentaries for the BBC. I got her contact details from one of the producers I'd worked with in Manchester, got in touch with her, we met, we got on well, and she said, well, why don't you be my researcher a few days a week, every now and again, help me make these programs. Great, brilliant, fantastic. And this is the part of the story that I always tell people coming into journalism, young student journalists, people who've just graduated. I tell them about how much luck, chance, right place, right time, how much those things play into a career in journalism. Because I was working on a program with this producer. I was using the studios at BBC Aberdeen one day to do an interview, and I went through to the kitchen to make a cup of tea at the same time as the office manager. And she remembered me. She had interviewed me for a job a year earlier, which I hadn't got. And I was crushed at the time. It was this TV runner's job. And I thought I could totally do that. And I didn't get the job. But she remembered me. And that meant we could kind of chat. And she asked what I was up to at the moment. And then she said, oh, we've actually just had a member of staff leave to take up a job in Glasgow. I need someone to do his job for 6 weeks. It's just 6 weeks. It won't be any more. I can promise you that. It will not be any more. Are you around? And I said, yes, I'm around. I'm available. I'd love to do it. And that 6 weeks turned into 6 months, which has turned into 15 years.
Wow.
And I always, to this day, still think, what if I hadn't gone through to the kitchen at that time to make a cup of tea? What if she had been on the phone and hadn't started chatting to me? What if? And so much of journalism is about just being in the right place at the right time. But of course, the other thing I tell people is you can increase your odds by being on more people's radars, being in more places, just kind of being a bit more kind of visible. And that was the start of my BBC career, really. And one of the good things about journalism is that, yes, you may have specialist knowledge of a certain topic or a certain subject or whatever, but the core skills of journalism don't change. You know, curiosity, communicating with people, telling stories, they don't change whether you're covering a war or a pandemic or, gallery opening. And so I tried lots of things out early in my career. Partly because I wanted to, but partly because I had to, because I was on all these short-term contracts. The bulk of the first 4 years of my career were thanks to women getting pregnant and me backfilling maternity leave. So I'm always grateful to those women for deciding to have families when they did. But it meant that I got to move around. And so I worked on documentaries, rural affairs programs, music shows. I produced BBC Scotland's arts program for a year or so, which came from Edinburgh, the home of the Edinburgh Festival, of course. So I tried all these amazing things. I'd had some experience at the World Service before. And then in 2014, I got a chance to go off on an attachment to the World Service, covering Europe as a reporter, producer, working with an American broadcasting organization. And I did that, and then kind of snowballed from there. When that attachment ended, back into the World Service, presenting on the radio. Then I went off to do some TV, then ended up presenting on TV, and now I'm chatting to you.
What an amazing set of events that got you here. I think I love what you said about how there are things you can do to increase your chances, but there are also there's a lot of luck involved. I think we have to appreciate both, right? When it comes down to finding the place that you need to be, making sure that you're as close to it as you can be, and I think there's so many things about that story that I want to unpick. So, for example, that question you said of what if you didn't drink tea?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
didn't drink tea, like maybe you wouldn't have done all the other things, right? And what an amazing person for that office manager to kind of give you that opportunity there and then as well. And also the way you managed failure, like you didn't get the job, you had to move back home, you were super low about it, but then you just kept going. And that's kind of a couple of the skill sets I was picking up, was that, you're obviously quite sociable and You're very dedicated. You don't let, you know, the idea of your feet getting wet worry you in terms of pursuing your dream. And I can totally relate to that. One of my first office jobs was as a part-time admin assistant for a video games company, and I had to travel 7 to 8 hours a day to get there and back, and it was during the coldest winter, and I was like, I don't know, how old was I? I must have been like 19 or something,
Right.
and it was, you know, there are people that were not turning up to work who lived like one village over, but I was literally traveling over counties and still making it in. I remember the manager coming in, but like, how did this guy get into the office? But half our workforce has phoned me up and said they can't make it in because of the snow. So, and that was one of the moments where I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm a little bit different to, or I have a little bit different level of motivation to get into a workplace. Like, my work ethic has always been really important to me. And it sounds like it is to you too. You're not going to let like a little bit of rain, a little bit of snow stop you from getting from A to B when you want to get there. Do you think that that's a rare component? Do you think that that's part of the formula that you're talking about that would help?
I think it kind of has to be in the media industry in general, because it's so competitive and it can be so circumstantial. You know, a program gets commissioned and suddenly 10 people have got jobs. A program gets decommissioned and suddenly 20 people are out of a job. And it can be so subjective what a hiring manager or a department or whatever is looking for. And you've got to not take it personally, because it's personal because they're saying, I don't want you, you're not right for me. But it's not personal because it's just about what they want rather than necessarily you as an individual. So, you know, for example, I didn't get that runner's job. That ended up working out fine. And I think sometimes, yes, it maybe sucks. Yes, maybe you have a crappy 24 hours because of it. But I think you've got to look, it's not about being glass half full. You've just got to think, well, what can I do instead? Or how could this actually be a good thing for me? How can I kind of turn this round? And I think you do have to be a bit persistent as well. So I think it's kind of a mix of all these things, really. And, you know, you might get told, no, you haven't got a job, but then, well, maybe you create a shadowing opportunity out of it, which then turns into something else, which then turns into something else. And I think the other thing is about saying yes. It's about grabbing opportunities with both hands, even if you're scared, even if you think I can't do this, even if you think someone else is better than me. Yes, I can do that. So, for example, I ended up presenting on TV by accident. I was on an attachment as a TV reporter. It was the early days of this new coronavirus, and the presenter who was due to be presenting that night called in sick, said, I think I have this virus. I can't come into the office and spread this disease. And the editor, this would have been about 10 to midnight, the editor, this wonderful woman called Jamsheda, no longer with the BBC, she's absolutely fantastic. She came up to me and she said two things. Rich, you are literally the only person in the building in a suit, and you present on the radio all the time. Do you want to give TV a shot tonight? Could you do it for us? And
Wow.
I was absolutely terrified, but I thought to myself, if I say no, they will never ask me again. Because the mentality will be, well, we asked him before and he didn't want to do it. So I just said yes. And I had about an hour's notice to go to makeup, to get my suit on, to go down to the studio. I'd never read an auto cue before, never presented on TV before. I'd done a bit of reporting, but never presented. And it was just that kind of sink or swim. And just do it. And learn from it, and, you know, watch yourself back. And, you know, again, there's something else I tell young journalists now. You will be, aside from Twitter, you will be your own harshest critic. So,
of course,
you know, I've been doing this, 5 years or so now. I still watch back my broadcasts, self-critique. I don't like the way I was fiddling with my pen there. I don't like my intonation on that cue. I don't really like that question, all this kind of stuff. But it's about saying yes to opportunities and just going for them and thinking, well, why not? If not me, then who?
It's so interesting. I got a job as a piano teacher in America, and I couldn't play the instrument.
That is a different level of confidence.
This was thank you. This is one of my favorite stories, and why I always tell people, like you just said, to just like go for it. I was at university at the time studying music, and I could play guitar, and there was a mix up with the placement that I got, and I went to the interviews and they were asking all these musical questions that were transposable to a guitarist. So I didn't pick up on the fact that I was being interviewed as a pianist. So like, oh, what kind of songs can you play? Can you play things that are upbeat? Can you teach, the notes really well? And so, yeah, it didn't occur to me. And then when I got offered the role, they mentioned it was piano. And I thought to myself in my own head, I was like, I'm glad I didn't say it out loud, but I thought to myself, this is meant to be for a piano teacher. This isn't. I thought it was for guitar. So I just yes, and luckily I had access to a recording studio because I was studying music. So I basically went into a recording studio every single day for like 2 weeks and just learned piano as well as I could. And I was being sponsored to be like flown over. I was going to be there for like months. I was worried that someone was going to find out and that I was going to have to get flown back and like pure embarrassment. But at the same time, I was like, I really want to do this. Like, this is something I really want to do. I love teaching and I love playing music, and I feel like I've got kind of good enough. And the thing is that I was teaching for like 7 hours a day. So before anyone could even notice, I was already like really good at it. So, and I remember actually there was this one kid who came on who he had like 10 years of private schooling, private tutoring, for piano. And he was playing like these Egyptian Mixolydian scales that I'd never heard of. And I remember thinking like, what am I going to do with this kid? Like, and I asked him, it's like, has anyone ever like taught you how to compose a song? And he said, no, we're very strict, like rules, must read the score kind of thing. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to teach you how to write a song. And he was lit up, Rich, because he'd never been given so much freedom in a music lesson.
Yeah, I can
imagine. I got to show him, how to piece chords together, like how to create a verse versus a chorus and things like that. That was stuff I already knew from my guitar playing. So I do think, like you said, like there's a massive part to just saying like yes and taking some managed risks.
Yeah,
I think if I didn't play an instrument at all, that would have been a bad decision.
Yeah.
But you like me in that scenario, you had some of a similar skill set that you thought, okay, I'm jumping in at the deep end of something I kind of know, right?
Yeah, and actually I want to flag that this because lots of people have imposter syndrome and have insecurities, and the same is absolutely true of me. And actually, the reason I was able to kind of pluck up my courage and say, yes, I'll do it then and there in that moment is because I'd had several years of keeping myself in a box, because I'd been told years previously, I'd spoken to a senior editor, I'd expressed an interest in working in TV, and they said to me, no, you work in radio, you couldn't do TV, it's too different. And I believed them, and I thought, well, they've been doing their job 20 years, I've never done their job before, they must be right. And so I took that to heart, and I sat on that, and I kept that in my head for several years. I'm a radio guy, this is all I can do, I couldn't possibly do TV. And then I just got to a point where I was just seeing my career kind of dead ending, and I realized it wasn't dead ending because of me, it was dead ending, well, it was dead ending because of me, but it was me putting these limits on myself based on what someone else had told me. And actually there was no reason that I couldn't do a TV report or present on the TV. And so it was kind of, yes, it was a confidence, but it was a born out of frustration confidence that I can absolutely do this, because I'd been sitting on that imposter syndrome for several years. And I think lots of people experience that, especially in an industry like journalism, like stuff in the media, where it's all on show, and everything we do, whether it's a broadcast or a radio program or it's stuff we put on Twitter, it's there, it's so visible. And you've got to remind yourself that this is a performance. It's all performative, because yes, someone may have done a really great report. You may see someone on the TV. You may see something they've posted on Twitter or Instagram or Threads or whatever, but you don't see what goes on behind the curtain. And there's so much work that goes into it, so many challenges, so many insecurities, etc., that I think everyone who's battling with that imposter syndrome has to remind themselves that they're not the only one thinking that. Others are thinking it too. And it's just whether you decide in that moment in time whether you have the confidence and the courage to push through it. And you know what? It's okay if you don't sometimes. It's okay to think like, I don't feel confident enough to put myself out there yet, or to try this new thing yet. I'm going to work on this skill. I'm going to build that, experience, whatever. And then maybe next week or next month or next year, I'll have the confidence to say, no, do you know what? Actually, I'm going to volunteer for this. I can do it.
I think love that. I think an exciting part of your story will be almost when you start saying no because you get too many opportunities coming your way. And you're like, I'm already doing so much I love. I can't take on another project.
Well, we'll see when that happens.
Yeah.
But I do like being organized and efficient. So at the moment, I'm doing all right.
Okay, that's great. This was not a question I thought of until you told that last story, because I think going back to the skill set of someone who can be a good journalist, obviously you have to be able to tell good stories, as you mentioned, right? So from your experience and kind of your wisdom, how do you captivate people with a story? Like what are the ways of captivating people to get them to listen and to be inspired and follow through?
So with the caveat that it's all subjective, depends on the audience you're talking to, and also depends on the story. Honestly, it's what interests you about it. There's this idea, I think, especially for young journalists, that you have to follow a certain line, that the editorial agenda is fixed, that you have to fit in a box, basically. I work for the BBC, therefore I have to report this in a BBC way. I work for the Times, therefore I have to report this in a Times way. And the Times focuses on like money and business and politics. And, another organization would focus on the scandal and the gossip and this and that and the other. And it's what you find interesting about it, because you know what? If you find it interesting, chances are someone else is going to find it interesting as well. So, for example, Turkish elections, lots of editorial meetings talking about the impact on NATO, the EU, relationship with Britain, America, all these kind of like high geopolitical things. But you know what? If you're sitting in that editorial meeting and you're like, well, do you know what? My family goes on one foreign holiday a year, and the one foreign holiday a year they go on is to Turkey, and they go to the same place in the same holiday park, and that's the holiday they can afford, and that's what they want to go on. But the elections in Turkey could change that. Then that's what's interesting to you. So I think it's really important to not put yourself into a box and think you have to be interested in certain things. If something interests you, then it may well interest someone else. And I think when it comes to telling the story, it's, again, not to overthink it. And of course, you do need to think carefully about how you report things, especially sensitive stories, complicated stories. But, imagine you're at a dinner party and your host introduces you to one of their other guests who you've never met before, and they say, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a journalist. Oh, cool, that's interesting. Are you working on any stories at the moment? Oh, I've just been looking into what happened in Russia last weekend. Oh, really? I hadn't heard about that. What happened? Well, how would you tell that person what happened? Be natural. What do you find interesting? How do you convey that information to someone else? You don't need to be stiff and formulaic and boring. And one of the things I really try hard to do in my presenting, and this is why I'd scrutinize myself and watch back all my programs, is because I like to walk that tightrope of being authoritative and knowledgeable, because these are important geopolitical sensitive stories, but also approachable. Because if someone switched on their TV and they just get this like really stiff, boring, telling something in a very flat way, not engaged, well, they're going to switch off, either mentally or literally switch away and go to another channel and probably not come back. So I kind of try and report every story as if I'm talking to a friend that I haven't seen in a couple of months who doesn't follow politics, or someone I've just been introduced to at a dinner party that hasn't read the papers this morning. That's kind of what I try and do.
What about with the camera, right? Because I've heard people who work with camera say the camera's my best friend. Do you feel like that, or are you very aware that it is like this mechanical device recording you that's going to be played back to millions of people?
Yeah, so I found it hard to adjust the cameras when I first moved to TV because, of course, in a radio studio, you don't need to worry. I mean, they do have cameras in them now because you want to catch moments and put them on social media and things. But generally speaking, in a radio studio, you're safe. You can fiddle with your scripts. You can write notes. You can be wearing shorts and t-shirt, whatever. So when I first started working with cameras, I did feel a little bit self-conscious and a bit rigid and a bit like there's 5 of them. They're remote controlled. They don't have people behind them, so you can't even pretend you're talking to the camera operator. So it felt a bit awkward and uncomfortable. And of course, you're focusing on doing an interview or reading a script. So you always have in your mind that you're being watched. And I just, over the period of, a few weeks and months and years, I've just had some really good advice from really experienced TV people. And, with that, being able to relax and kind of work with the cameras a bit better. And you do have to figure out a way to work with the camera in the same way that, we're all used to this now. You do on a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever, when you kind of have to be in vision and present to a boss or a client or whatever.
Can't pick your nose in a meeting anymore.
Yeah, exactly. You can't. It's again, it's the kind of talking to a friend thing. It's the difference between sitting stiff and thinking I have to read a script and looking down the barrel and saying, hello, very good to have you with us. Let's take a look at what's happening around the world today. And it's just that getting used to it. And again, it's personal and subjective for everyone. I think Clive Myrie is brilliant at it. I think he comes across as so personable on screen. I think other people do the really authoritative thing as reporters, but maybe not the warmth of a presenter. But, everyone has his different style and you have to find what works for you.
So it's really interesting you mentioned that warmth piece because Vanessa Van Edwards is someone I follow hugely. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, but you're aware of her, right?
Yeah.
So she talks about charisma, and I think that the 2 variables is like competence and warmth.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, if you can get the sweet spot of that, that's the charisma zone. Essentially, whereas what people sometimes do is they see these characters on TV, kind of like Harvey from Suits or Tom Cruise, and they see like that they're annoyingly skilled at things and they can be a bit like up their own butt, but actually that's not charisma. That's just the competence piece. It's when actually they're still human and able to engage and communicate really nicely, but also have that high degree of competence where you trust their judgment and their credibility.
And actually, you mentioned a really important word there, human, because the stories we tell, often it's people at the heart of it. And so, for example, I was on air yesterday and we had some big stories about Russia, Ukraine, US cluster bombs, and then we had the story about the second name being announced of a young girl who died when a car crashed into a school in London. I mean, this is an 8-year-old child and has a family, and so many people in the audience will connect with that. And it's not about you don't fake it as a presenter because you shouldn't have to, because you are human as well. And the audience, as you say, they want/need that mix, because when you're telling them something really important and serious is happening, an ongoing terror attack or something, they have to trust that you're getting things right, because this is vital information. We're seeing, unfortunately, just a series of violent events in Sudan at the moment, for example, been going on for a couple of weeks now. There will be many people watching and listening to the BBC who have family in Sudan, and they want to trust that you are telling them accurate information, and that if you're interviewing, say, British government ministers about what they're doing about it, that you're going to represent them, really, and ask the tough questions that need asking. But then also, when you're telling them a sad story about a child having died as a result of her injuries in a car crash, be human as well, because you're human, you're talking to another human. So it is that kind of that mix, that balance. And as I say, everyone's different. Everyone has their own way of finding what works for them, really.
How do you manage your emotions when you get like these really tragic stories, especially that involve kids. I mean, it must be like when you get it and you've got to read it out. It's kind of like it's almost hurtful to describe, but at the same time, you're doing your job. Like, what's your kind of strategy for managing that?
Yeah, I think with this young girl last night, actually, I kind of struggled to read that script, which I'm usually able to get through it, and it just there was. I think with that case, it was because there wasn't very much time to prepare because it landed as breaking news, and it was confirmed, verified, so we just did it. I think you've got to not worry too much about it because you are human, and it is okay if you need to say to the audience, I'm sorry about that, or just need a second. That's actually okay. I think the audience would be understanding and forgiving.
I'd respect that.
Yeah. I think most people would. And I think with other stories, sadly, much of the work in journalism is reporting negative stuff. And I know you want to talk about the police later, and there's a similarity there. No one calls the police when they're having a great day. They call the police when they're having the worst day of their lives.
True.
And it's about how you deal with that. And everyone has a different thing that kind of doesn't isn't nice for them to deal with. We have lots of people that have to look at unedited, unpixelated raw footage of war crimes being committed, or dead bodies and things like that, and some people have to deal with that, and they're fine with it. I've never had really too much of an issue with the death, the wounds, the blood, the gore. Don't know why. I just never really have. Which is weird because I hate getting injections. Needles freak me out. So on a personal level, I hate it, but in a work environment, I'm okay with it. But I remember one of the stories I found hardest to cover was the migrant crisis of 2015. And I was in in France, and I went to the jungle refugee camp in Calais. And I found that an incredibly hard story to cover. And one of the reasons I found it so hard was because I'd gone from my, nice enough flat in a nice area of London to a hotel in Paris to a hotel in Calais where I'd had a nice sleep and a nice breakfast and a hot shower. And then I got in a taxi for 10 minutes and I ended up in this place where these people had nothing. They had nothing. The correspondent I was working with and we took the miniature shampoos and shower gels and soaps and biscuits from our hotel room to give to them because they had nothing. And then, we talked to them, we did our reporting, we did our interviews, we interviewed people from the UN and all these aid agencies. And then we left in a taxi and then back to our nice hotel, had a nice dinner that night. Then the next day got on a train back to London. And the next day I was at a friend's birthday party where there was a DJ and a barbecue and this and that and the other. And I found that really difficult. And it's those kinds of stories for me which are the tough ones, because it's about the inequality and the unfairness and that kind of thing. And these people really did have absolutely nothing. And actually that experience prompted me to go and learn Arabic, which I had to kind of put to one side after a year for various other reasons. But the reason I wanted to do it was because I speak English, I speak French, and these people spoke neither. And all I wanted to do, they were terrified of anyone who looked like any kind of authority figure. So, white guy turns up with a BBC microphone and all this kit, and, that's an authority figure to these people. And all I wanted to do was say to them, hello, my name's Rich. I just want to talk to you. That's all. And I couldn't do that because they didn't speak French and they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Arabic. And so when I came back from that trip, I started taking Arabic lessons just so I could help bridge that gap, because communication is so important in what we do.
Amazing. And with the stories, you've covered some of like the world's biggest stories. So you're involved with the COVID story, and you're also involved with the Trump impeachment. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, yeah, I've covered a fair mix.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So tell me about. I mean, how does it work in terms of who tells what story as a journalist? Does the BBC have like a list of reporters and their kind of credentials? Is it, whoever puts their hand up first? Like, how does that work? How do you get a story?
Yeah, do you know what? It's almost like how I got my job. It's sometimes the luck and the chance comes down to it. I mean, we have reporters all around the world, and often it's someone in the field based in that bureau which will cover a story. They'll go out, they'll file, whatever, Washington correspondent, Delhi correspondent, whatever. And when I was on my TV reporter attachment, it was working overnight. So lots of the correspondents were in bed asleep. And so when a big story landed, it landed on my desk because I was the reporter, and it was as simple as that.
Okay.
And so with lots of things like the Trump impeachment, like locust plagues hitting East Africa and pictures coming in of that, I was just there. And also, you pitch yourself for stories as well. So, you have a meeting every shift. What stories are people following? What are they interested in? And, we all have our own personal biases. Nothing wrong with that. Everyone's an individual. And I would say I'm really interested in this. This locust plague in East Africa is going to cause millions of dollars worth of damage and deprive already starving populations of thousands of tons of, wheat and grain supplies. I really want to do this. I think it's really important. Or there's this virus in China. I think it's really important, all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of how it can play out.
So in this case, with you reporting that the first death of from the COVID virus, it landed on your desk. So, or was it something that you were like, hey, this is something I really want to do.
Yeah,
I really want to go out there. Like, how did you find yourself, going to China to essentially cover this story that was like fairly not massive at all? It was they believed it was just local for across like 40. It was under 100 people, right?
Yeah.
And so you had presumably no inkling that this was going to turn into something significant.
Well, so I didn't go to China. I covered it from London.
Oh, you covered it from London. Okay.
But it was something I'd seen. And so the BBC and other news organizations had already reported in, I think, November, December 2019, that there was this virus that Chinese officials had detected. So that wasn't new news. Not many people knew about it, but it wasn't brand new. And then in January 2019, I think it was the 12th of January 2019, this man died. And a couple of my colleagues on World Service Radio had done, just straight reports on it. China's confirmed the death of this man from this mysterious disease. And I have a good friend at work, very skilled colleague who it's her job to monitor Chinese state media and social media. And she'd filed something on Chinese media reports about the death of this man. And I thought this is really interesting. And especially because it had been compared to the SARS virus of a few years previously, which I remember happening and, killed nearly 800 people. And we had our team meeting that night and everyone was going around pitching their stories. And as you all remember, the person in the White House at the time was Donald Trump. Every new day brought a new series of tweets or news stories or policy changes or whatever. It was a constantly, frenetic news environment. And I pitched doing this China virus story. A man's died of this mysterious virus that Chinese officials say is similar to SARS. And that killed nearly 800 people. Just imagine if this goes on to kill nearly 800 people. It crippled Southeast Asia for, many, many months. And the initial reaction was, oh, it's interesting. But Donald Trump's tweeted this or done that. And that's really the most important story. And you kind of need to do that one. And I said, I really think this virus thing is interesting. I tell you what, I'll do the Donald Trump story first. And then I want to do the China story. And so my boss said, okay, fine. So I did the Trump story, knocked out a report on that. And then I did this China virus story. And there was this interview that I managed to get hold of with this Chinese official where he said, only 40 people are infected. Don't worry, it's all under control. And I think that was basically the last line in my report.
Crazy.
And yeah, it's on YouTube and, you can watch it back and it gives me goosebumps to watch it because, of course, we all know what happened next. But the thing is, so that was the first TV report by an international broadcaster. And, this virus started to spread, as, we all now know. And I really struggled to get attention on it. And, for consecutive nights on end, I was pitching a new update on this virus, because the first country it spread to after China, it was Thailand, and then South Korea, I think, and then Japan. And I kept saying, it's gone to Thailand now. It's gone to South Korea. I want to do an update. So for days, I was doing these new updates on this virus that most people
bugging
still
your boss
weren't.
saying, let me report more on this.
Yeah, basically. And still not many people were interested in it. And then boom, it hits northern Italy. And then boom.
Yes.
It hits Washington State. And boom, 2 cases in England. And suddenly the European and British presses were interested, and people were coming to me because they were searching in the BBC News system for this new virus, and they were seeing all these reports with my name attached to them. And I was getting emails and phone calls from people saying, oh, I'm doing a story on these 2 people in England who are sick from this virus, and I see you've done a couple of reports on how it hit Thailand and South Korea. What do I need to know? But yeah, that's how that happened.
That's absolutely crazy. And the fact that you persisted, because you said persistence earlier.
Yeah,
I really think there's something to this story. And if you had just done a response, you wouldn't have been reporting on it.
You've also got to remember that, when you work somewhere like the BBC, it's an article of record. It's not just like a tweet that someone puts up that may or may not be found in 6 years' time. And I do remember thinking at the time, what if this goes on to kill 800 people? That's a lot of people. And I thought, with the BBC, we should be documenting world events like this. And I'm really glad we did.
Yeah. And presumably that must have impacted your career quite positively as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it certainly meant I got a lot of airtime back then, because these reports, which initially were running at 5 a.m. UK time, started to, get more and more airtime. And then as the, things with the pandemic got worse, we were all of those of us who were on air were just on air a lot more, covering the latest twists and turns. So whereas ordinarily I might have done, say, 1 story a day on the latest thing Donald Trump has tweeted, or the latest thing that then Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said, you're suddenly on air because people, we all know news consumption went up during the pandemic. People really wanted to know what was going on. And actually, I often, when I do schools talks and things like that, I use the COVID example to talk about foreign news, because foreign news is what I'm really interested in. Lots of people, of course, are really interested in what's happening around the world, but lots of people aren't. And they want to know what's happening in their local area, maybe national politics, and that's about it. Why should I care about something that's happening on the other side of the world? Totally legitimate, thing to say. A man dies in China, affected everyone's lives. Everyone's. Foreign news is really, really important. What's happening on the other side of the world can, and often does, affect your life, your business, your family, your livelihood, your holiday plans, the economy, all these kinds of things. It's one of the things I find really fascinating about international news, is that kind of ripple effect.
There's a book called The End of October, which is by a guy called Lawrence Wright, and he wrote this story, a fictitious story about a novel virus creating a pandemic in the spring of 2020. And he published the book in April 2020. How crazy
is
that?
Yeah, so I have heard of this book actually. Yeah, it
gets weirder.
It's quite creepy. Yeah,
he predicted a bunch of stuff, Rich. So he predicted there would be hate crimes against the minority for the spread of the virus. He predicted there would be shortages on ventilators. I can't remember what else, but there was so many interesting things that he predicted. The craziest one, though, the one that I absolutely love, is that he's known for kind of going really deep into his research and getting very meticulous with the information in his stories. And so the experts he was speaking to about creating the virus were the same individuals who created the vaccine.
Oh,
for
really?
the real virus.
Wow. Nostradamus of our age.
And in a story, it literally starts at the same time. The first case is in Asia. It's a crazy story that was published at a crazy time. It was very eerie. I think the Guardian or the Independent, one of the two, did a really good interview with him where he talks about it, and he said he said something along the lines of like, when I was reading the newspapers at the time, it was like reading pages from my book.
Right. I'll add that to my reading list.
It's good. So we talked about COVID. You've obviously done some really interesting stories, and when you kind of look at, say, for example, the time that you've spent working in the field, in the industry, you've somehow figured out a way to do riot training.
Yeah. So actually, this is it's quite important because we do have to go out and cover protests and demonstrations, and so actually, it's something that the BBC organises. We are lucky to work for an organisation that invests in its journalists and its journalism, and to send, like any other employer, the BBC has obligations when it comes to our health and safety.
Of course.
And so we go and do what's called public order training, and we actually train with the Metropolitan Police, and it's really useful for us because it means that they have this training facility that they use with these fake streets, fake buildings, etc.
Cool.
And it's done over a few days, and it scales up from a little fight to a full-scale riot. And I mean full-scale, like at the end of it, you are in flame-proof overalls having petrol bombs thrown at you as police horses and police dogs are charging down the street, and you're being charged by cops with riots. So it's really great for us because it's real-life experience. It's also actually really great for the police because, of course, in a real-life situation, they have to deal with nosy journalists asking questions, lurking around, and so on. And so it's a really kind of useful relationship that we have. And then we also have what's called HEFAT. It stands for Hostile Environment First Aid Training. And the idea of hostile environment training isn't new, but it used to, as in before my time, used to be much more about, it's called the bombs and bullets course, dodging bombs, where to hide from bullets, etc. But then there's been this kind of shift in attitudes that actually you're not that likely to get hit by a bomb or a bullet. What's important is how to survive if you do. So it's called Hostile Environment First Aid Training because the bulk of it is on first aid and, how to stop someone bleeding out, how to, stop a sucking chest wound, all these kinds of things.
Wow.
But of course, hostile environment is a pretty loose term. Yes, of course, a war zone is a hostile environment, but the jungle can be a hostile environment. Going into a rogue state where the state monitors your electronic activity is a hostile environment for a journalist. Going to the Antarctic is a hostile environment. So there are elements of the course about working in these hostile states. We get fake kidnapped as part of it and interrogated. They've gone through our social media beforehand. They grill us about our family, our relationships.
Oh my God.
Which world leaders we've met, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, working in disaster zones. I mean, the United States of America is a civilized country, but boom, if Kentucky gets hit with a tornado and there's no power, no sanitation, that is a hostile environment. So you get trained and taught on how to survive in these environments, whether it's a simple thing of eating, drinking, going to the toilet, building a shelter, or whether it's how to deal with corrupt military generals or, airstrikes on a remote village. So yeah, they're great fun. But of course, there is that real, edge of reality to it. Certainly for many of my colleagues currently out in the field, especially given what's going on in the moment in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Russia. These are difficult, unpleasant places to work. So it's really important to do these training courses.
So what's it like for those guys who are, in the middle of essentially a war zone?
You have to be constantly switched on. There's no kind of downtime. I mean, for example, one of my colleagues who I really admire is Steve Rosenberg. He's our Moscow correspondent. We have, and his producer as well, I have to credit him, Will Vernon. We used to have a bigger team in Moscow, but one by one, they got their credentials revoked. Steve Rosenberg still has his credentials, as does his producer, Will. And so they are working in Moscow and traveling around Russia, of course, and the region. Steve and Will were in Belarus recently, I think. So they're traveling around this environment where the state tolerates them, but doesn't really want them there. And they're doing an incredibly difficult job. And they, of course, have family and friends. And, they want to be able to communicate with people back home. They want to talk to their boss without fear of being listened in. So I think it's quite exhausting, this feeling of kind of constantly having to be on. And, same for our colleagues in Ukraine as well, where 4 a.m, an air raid siren can go off. 6 a.m, you're getting in an armored Land Rover to go to the front lines. So I think it can be quite tiring, basically.
Is there any combat training?
You mean like hand-to-hand combat?
Yeah.
No.
No, okay.
So on HEFAT you do get taught some kind of some self-defense. You do get taught some self-defense stuff. But it's mostly about avoiding getting into those situations in the first place, which again comes back to the communication, which is just such an important part of what we do.
So you're obviously extremely busy, doing all these things, but in your spare time, you are a qualified advanced off-road
Yeah, don't miss
driver,
the advanced.
Right?
Thank you very much.
Advanced, yeah. I was going to throw that in there. So firstly, I didn't even know that was a thing, that you could become, a qualified, any one of us can just become a qualified advanced off-road driver. Can you tell me a bit about that and also how you find the time to do that?
Yeah, so again, because of where I grew up, used to have to drive everywhere. So I was, driving as soon as I was 17. And when I was in the police, I had some driving training in the police, obviously. And part of that did include, some off-road skills. And actually going back to the HEFAT, even as a journalist working in a war zone, the stats say that you're more likely to be injured in a car accident than, shot or bombed or something. And as well as that, it's just something I enjoy. But also in my spare time, especially because of where I grew up, I do like to go hiking, climbing, canoeing, and get out to kind of less accessible places. And so a few years ago, I wanted to refresh my kind of driver training. And so I did the recertification on my basic off-road driving, and then I did my advanced one as well. And it's great fun. I would thoroughly recommend it because, again, it's just about how to be safer, and if I'm taking some friends on a hiking trip and we're going up these, farm tracks, or, to be honest, you don't even need to be like going up difficult tracks. You can just be driving in deep snow, or sand or something. And, just want to know how to be able to do it safer, rescue myself if I need to. So you deal with all things like driving through floods, snow, ice, mud. Mud is so much fun, in a safe and controlled way, of course. Ruts, inclines, steep ascents, steep descents, winching, how to rescue, self-rescue, all that kind of stuff. Just a really good, fun, practical skill, and one that I've certainly had to use over the years.
I'm just a little bit suspicious, Rich, that you're kind of lining yourself up with all this TV stuff and driving, that you actually want to be in a Fast and Furious movie or become a stunt driver. Like, where's this going?
Well, if they want to talk to me about that, then I'm happy to discuss my feet.
They can speak to your publicist.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. One of the things I wanted to ask you, that's a really important question that I like to ask a lot of people, is who have you helped and who helped you?
Oh, that's a really great question. I'm going to answer the second one first. Who helped me was that first producer I met at university, who gave me his business card and said to keep in touch with him. And his name's Mark Rickards. I was very lucky in that couple of years into my BBC career, maybe a year or so, I ended up actually getting to work with him as his researcher, which was a real privilege and honor, because I just, from the moment I met him, I'd actually knew who he was beforehand because I'd listened to some of his programs, hugely admired the kind of programs and documentaries he made. And also the freelance producer I worked with in Aberdeen, a woman called Edie Stark, who was so encouraging and supportive, and she actually got my very first documentary on the air. It was a program about young male suicide in Scotland, self-harm and suicide. I grew up in this rural community where it sadly wasn't uncommon to hear in the news about someone being killed on the road in a car accident, and it was a name you knew from the village because everyone traveled by car. It was just relatively common. And then, I was shocked to learn when I was kind of in my early 20s that actually I was more likely statistically to kill myself as a young man in Scotland than be killed on the roads. And that horrified me. And I thought, we have to do this program about this. And Glasgow, especially at the time, had this reputation of, violence, especially amongst young men, gangs, and so on. And so, I was talking to Edie about this at the time, and I said, I think we should do a program about it. And she said, great. But she was a presenter. She said, shouldn't be me doing it, Rich. It should be you. I'm a, middle-aged woman. I shouldn't be talking to these young men about why they're violent towards themselves and other people. It should be you. And so she got me my first commission. And as part of this commission, and actually this goes back to why I love radio so much, it's so much more intimate than TV. As part of this documentary, I went into Parliament Young Offenders Institute, and I had this session arranged with these, I think, 10 young men between the ages of maybe kind of 16 and 19, all of whom had been arrested and locked up for violent offences and had, gang histories and all this kind of stuff. And I put my recording equipment on the table. I said, listen, I've not switched this on yet. This is the program I'm making. This is why I'm doing it. This is what I want to find out. And I'm going to ask you some really personal questions about your backstories and why you've ended up where you are. If I'm going to ask you that stuff, it's only fair you know a bit about me first. So I told them about myself. And then I said, okay, now I'm going to switch my equipment on, and I just want you to be honest with me. And I would hold my microphone in front of one of them and I'd say, why are you here? Tell me your story. And these young guys in front of each other just totally opened up. And that would not have happened if there'd been a TV camera and lights and a producer and stuff there. It was just me and these guys and obviously a prison warden. And they were just completely open with me. So Mark and Edie are two people who helped me fantastically. In terms of who I've helped, that's a really tough one because I like to help as many people as I can. It's just kind of in my nature. And, I quite often get younger journalists either on my team or in other teams coming up to me wanting a chat. And there's sometimes this reputation that journalism has to be really hard-nosed and edgy and, to be honest, a bit rude and abrasive, and it doesn't. I think that's really old school, potentially kind of born out of these smoky newsrooms type things. And there's a bit of a legacy of that hanging around in some places, but it doesn't have to be like that. And so I often, will have chats, coffees with people who want some advice, want to pick my brains. I do some formal mentoring as well. So the BBC has an internal scheme called the Global Women in News Scheme. So I've done that for, I think, 5 years now, where I'm paired up with a female journalist. And that's all about, equality and all that kind of stuff. And making a kind of less difficult environment for especially young women in the industry. And I have a mentor through this scheme organised by, it's called Black Ballad, and that's about encouraging more Black women to get into journalism. And then I'm also a senior fellow on the John Schofield Trust, which is about kind of socioeconomic diversity in newsrooms. So I have a few people I mentor through official channels. And then more recently, I put this post up on LinkedIn about my own career journey. And off the back of that, I had a load of people getting in touch with me. And I think at last count, I've had something like 70 meetings with these, mostly, some people already, a few years into their career and wanting a kind of sense check and a chat and a bit of advice. But mostly they're either at university or they've just graduated, or, university or college wasn't for them, which is absolutely fine. And they want a kind of early career chat. So I just hope that I've given them something useful, which kind of helps them. And I would actually be more happy if it's not a practical thing like, this is how you do this on Final Cut Pro, or this is how this camera works. I hope it's a confidence thing, because that's something I really lacked in the early days of my career. This imposter syndrome, this idea that I couldn't be or shouldn't be where I was. And actually, yes, I absolutely can. And everyone, when it comes to something about journalism, which is about telling everyone's stories for the benefit of everyone has a right to be involved in that, I think.
I agree, completely agree. So, and what you were saying about like the kind of the young journalists or students who were reaching out to you, has that inspired you to just keep on?
Totally, yeah. And one of the really nice things about it is how useful it's been for me, because I've learned about their backgrounds, their passions, their interests, what they like about journalism, what they don't like about journalism. It's taught me a lot about the way the industry is going to shape and change in years to come, I think. Journalism shouldn't be top down. It should be, equal. Every opinion should be considered and valid. And yeah, it's been hugely interesting.
I mean, I know I was joking about the course, the time management course at the beginning of the podcast, but now I'm actually thinking it would be a good idea for you to do like a workshop around schools or something on how to become a journalist.
I'm an obsessive list maker. That's how I do my time management. And I used to think I was a bit of a freak with that until I listened, because I'm actually a really slow reader. I read really slowly, but I listen really quickly. I listened to the audiobook of Barack Obama's autobiography, and he starts off by saying, I'm an obsessive list maker. And I was like, yes, okay, fine, vindicated. If Barack Obama's a list maker, it's okay for me to be a list maker as well.
That's definitely a great role model to want to relate to. What's next for you, Rich?
Honestly, I love doing what I'm doing. I know it sounds a bit of a cliche. I really love journalism and what I'm doing. It's an honor. It's a privilege. I get to bear witness to history. I get to, I get access to these amazing people. I get to talk to former ambassadors, academic experts, think tank people, regular person on the street who's got an opinion about something. I get access to those people. I get to talk to them. And then I get to share that information with someone else. Bit of a professional gossip kind of environment there. And every day I'm learning, especially at somewhere like the BBC, where I'm just surrounded by so many smart people who are experts on so many different things. So I don't know. I love doing radio. I love doing TV. I'd love to do more of the same. I do miss being out and about. Obviously I'm mostly in the studio at the moment. I would love to get back out in the field, whether it's as a special correspondent, a foreign correspondent, I don't know. But we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, awesome. Well, Rich, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. It's been an incredible podcast. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners are going to absolutely love the stories and the information you've shared. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's been great to talk to you.
All right. Take care, Rich.
Thank you. Bye.